In the fall of 1908, when the nights in the Missouri Ozarks began to sharpen and the wind turned cold enough to slip beneath doors, something strange began to move through the hollows around Cedar Hollow. Folks said the woods grew different that year, quieter somehow, as though the trees themselves were listening. And when Martha Brennan vanished, the forest seemed to inhale and hold its breath, waiting. Martha had always been a peculiar woman, but in a harmless, backwoods sort of way. She lived alone, kept to herself, and carried old country beliefs that most had long outgrown. The neighbors noticed she'd started lighting a red lantern outside her window at night, claiming it kept the wandering things from scratching at her walls. People smiled politely and dismissed her fears as loneliness twisting her thoughts, but even the bravest men walked a bit faster when passing her side of the woods after dusk. The night before she disappeared, several families said they heard something strange drifting through the fog, soft whispering weaving through the branches, too faint to understand, too steady to be the wind. One farmer swore he heard Martha's voice mingled with another that sounded deeper, older, as if the earth itself was speaking through cracks in the soil. But no one went to check. In Cedar Hollow, curiosity was a dangerous habit. At dawn, Martha was seen walking toward the woods with her red lantern swinging at her side, her boots carrying her toward the thickest part of the timber. Her eyes were wide and glassy, as though she were following something just out of sight. No one stopped her. No one asked where she was going. She simply disappeared into the tree line and did not return. By midday, her lantern was found lying beside a moss-covered log, still warm to the touch, its glass smeared with fingerprints, some belonging to Martha, and others too large and oddly shaped to belong to any person the search party knew. When the sheriff lifted it from the ground, a hush fell over the men as if the woods resented the disturbance. From that moment on, the search twisted into something darker than a simple missing person case. Tracks that didn't make sense. Sounds that died before reaching the ear. Cold pockets of air where the breath fogged even at noon. At night, lights flickered between the trees, and more than one villager claimed to hear Martha calling their name long after her voice should have been silenced forever. Something in those woods had taken her, something patient, something aware, something that knew how to speak just like a human but wasn't one. And Cedar Hollow would soon learn that whatever whispered to Martha Brennan hadn't finished speaking. Martha Brennan's final morning began long before the rest of Cedar Hollow even stirred, the sky still a heavy slate blue and the mist thick enough to soften the shapes of cabins and fence posts. She stepped out of her small wooden home with a deliberate slowness, as if listening for something before allowing the door to shut behind her. In her hand she carried the red lantern that had become a familiar sight to anyone passing by her place at night, though seeing it burning before sunrise felt immediately unsettling to those few early risers who noticed her drifting toward the woods. The flame flickered unsteadily inside the glass, casting uneven streaks of crimson across her face, making her wide, sleepless eyes appear even more haunted than usual. Villagers later recalled that she looked as though she had not slept for days, her hair unbrushed, her coat thrown hastily around her shoulders, her steps guided not by purpose but by compulsion. Some claimed she was whispering to herself as she walked, though others insisted she wasn't talking to herself at all, that her murmurs rose and paused in strange intervals, as if she were responding to something hidden beyond the fog. One farmer swore he heard her say, "I'm coming, I hear you," her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and surrender that made the hairs on his arms stand up. When someone called out to ask where she was headed, she didn't turn, didn't slow, didn't acknowledge the world around her. It was as though she were moving in a trance, following a path only she could see. Those who watched her disappear into the tree line later admitted they felt a cold ripple push through the morning air the moment she crossed into the shadowed timber. The forest at that hour was still and gray, heavy with leftover night, the kind of quiet that made even seasoned woodsmen uneasy. Yet Martha walked forward without hesitation, lantern held close to her chest, her breathing harsh enough to be heard by the nearest witness. Someone mentioned that her boots seemed to drag more than usual, like she was resisting her own steps yet unable to stop them. Her neighbors would later replay that morning again and again in their minds, realizing too late that her strange behavior had been a silent plea or a warning they failed to understand. Not one person followed her, not one person stopped her, and within moments the fog folded behind her like a curtain closing, leaving nothing but the memory of a red lantern's glow swallowed by the endless gray of the woods. The discovery of Martha Brennan's lantern became the moment when the search for her shifted from concern to dread, because nothing about the way it was found made sense to the men who came across it. It was nearing midday when the first search party reached the denser stretch of woods, a place where the trees grew so close together their branches knitted overhead like a cathedral of twisted limbs. Sunlight barely filtered through, falling in thin, cold stripes across the forest floor. The air smelled of damp earth and old leaves, and every sound the men made seemed muffled, as though the woods wished to silence them. They spread out, calling Martha's name, checking brush, creek beds, and hollowed logs. It was Sheriff Dalton who spotted a faint glint of red about 30 yards ahead, half buried in shadow near a fallen moss-covered log. At first he thought it was a cluster of autumn berries catching the light, but as he stepped closer he recognized the familiar glass shape. Martha's red lantern lay tipped on its side, the handle hooked awkwardly around a protruding root as if pulled or dropped mid-motion. Dalton crouched and reached for it, and the moment his fingers closed around the metal frame he jerked his hand back in surprise. The lantern was still warm, fresh warm, as if someone had set it down only minutes earlier, not hours after Martha had vanished into the woods. The flame had burned out, but heat lingered stubbornly inside the metal, raising more questions than answers. The glass was smeared with fingerprints. Some were small and narrow, consistent with Martha's own hands, which villagers knew were thin and delicate from years of washing and mending. But one print on the side was glaringly out of place, larger, broader, and oddly shaped, like a human hand pressed unevenly against the glass but stretched in a way no normal hand should be. Dalton called the others over, and the men gathered around it in uneasy silence, each sensing something was deeply wrong. The ground around the lantern showed faint impressions of disturbed leaves, but no clear tracks leading in or out, as if whatever had touched it moved without weight or left no mark the forest was willing to reveal. One man muttered that lanterns didn't stay warm that long unless someone had been holding it recently. Another argued that the forest floor was cold enough to draw out heat quickly, making its warmth even more troubling. The more they spoke, the more the woods seemed to tighten around them, the air thinning, the stillness thickening. The lantern should have been a clue, a comfort, a sign that Martha wasn't far. Instead it felt like a warning left in plain sight, a message that whatever she had followed into those woods had touched her belongings, and perhaps stood right where they were standing, watching them from the veil of trees. The neighbor who reported hearing the whispering the night before Martha vanished was a widower named Eli Turner, a man known for keeping to himself and never embellishing a story. That was why, when he finally spoke up, the entire search effort paused to listen. Eli lived just across a narrow stretch of clearing from Martha's cabin, close enough that in the quiet of night he could hear her porch boards creak if she stepped outside. On the evening before she disappeared, he'd been sitting by his window, whittling a piece of cedar and letting the last of his lamp oil burn low. It was well after midnight when he heard the first sound drifting toward him, a soft murmur that he assumed was the wind brushing the cabin walls. But the tone wasn't natural, it rose and fell in a steady, deliberate rhythm, like words being spoken too quietly to understand. Eli set down his carving knife, leaning closer to the window, and felt the prickle of unease crawl across his back. He recognized Martha's voice, thin, wavering, strained in a way he'd never heard before. She sounded frightened, or perhaps exhausted, as though she'd been arguing with someone for a long while. He cracked the window open a hair to hear better, and that was when the second voice drifted through the still night air, a low, gravelly whisper that made Eli's blood run cold. It wasn't a voice he recognized from Cedar Hollow, nor did it carry the cadence of any local dialect. It was deeper than any voice he had ever heard, so deep it almost vibrated the air, and he felt it more in his bones than his ears. The two voices overlapped, Martha whispering urgently, the unknown voice responding slowly, its tone calm but laced with something Eli could only describe later as hunger. He couldn't make out the words, no matter how hard he strained, but he knew without question that Martha wasn't speaking to herself. The exchange continued for several minutes, growing more frantic on Martha's end, until suddenly the voices stopped. Not faded, stopped. As though someone had cut the sound from the air with a knife. The silence that followed was so heavy Eli felt smothered by it, the kind of unnatural quiet that presses on the chest and warns a man to stay exactly where he is. Eli had considered calling out to her, but something in that silence warned him not to. He felt watched, not by Martha, but by something else lurking in the darkness between their homes. When dawn came and Martha was nowhere to be seen, guilt settled in Eli's stomach like a stone. He replayed the night again and again, realizing he might have been the last person to hear her alive, and the only one to hear whatever had been whispering back to her. The discovery of the unusual footprint was the moment the search party realized they were no longer dealing with a simple disappearance, because what they found beside Martha's trail didn't fit any explanation they could accept without shivering. By the second day of searching, the men had pushed deeper into the woods, following the scant signs Martha had left behind, a broken twig here, a scuffed patch of earth there, nothing clear enough to show intent but just enough to suggest she had wandered further than anyone expected. It was Caleb Price, a hunter with keen eyes and steady nerves, who first noticed the odd pattern in the damp soil near a slope leading toward the creek. At first glance, he thought it was just another human footprint, but as he crouched and brushed away loose leaves, the shape became disturbingly clear. It was bare, no shoe, no boot tread, just the outline of a naked foot pressed into the earth. But it wasn't normal. The heel was longer than it should have been, the arch too deep, and the toes tapered in a way that made Caleb's stomach twist. It looked human, but not quite. Almost like someone had taken a normal footprint and stretched it, reshaped it, distorted it into something familiar yet wrong. Worse still, it sat directly beside what were unmistakably Martha's boot prints, as though the two had walked side by side. Caleb called the others over, and soon a small circle of men gathered around the mark, their expressions shifting from curiosity to unease. Sheriff Dalton knelt beside it, comparing the stride with Martha's. That was when the true impossibility revealed itself. Martha's tracks were spaced at normal walking intervals, predictable and steady. But the barefoot print's stride jumped several feet ahead, far too long for any human to reach without running or leaping, yet the depth of the print suggested a calm, even step with weight evenly distributed. As though whatever made it had simply glided forward, covering impossible distances with minimal effort. The surrounding ground offered no additional clues. No broken branches. No drag marks. No sign of a person running or stumbling. Just the faint continuation of those unnaturally spaced prints fading into the thicker brush. A few of the men muttered about tricks of the soil or animals deforming a track, but no creature native to the Ozarks walked upright with human-like feet. The silence that followed grew heavier with each passing moment, a collective understanding settling in that the woods were holding back more than they revealed. Caleb, who rarely scared, finally whispered what the others had been thinking but were too afraid to say aloud, that Martha had not been walking alone, and that whatever walked beside her moved in a way no human ever could. The torn journal page was found on the third day of searching, carried by a gust of wind that seemed almost intentional, as though the forest itself had grown tired of keeping secrets. It fluttered down from a low branch and landed at the feet of Nora Hale, one of the few women brave enough to join the search. She recognized the handwriting immediately, Martha's looping, uneven script, the kind formed by someone who wrote often in dim lamplight. The edges of the page were jagged, ripped rather than cut, and the paper was damp as if it had been exposed to morning dew for several nights. Nora called the others over, her voice trembling not from fear but from the weight of what the discovery could mean. Sheriff Dalton carefully unfolded the page, and the ink had run in several places, the words smudged into ghostly streaks. But the sentences that remained clear enough to read chilled every person gathered around. Martha had written about waking up in unfamiliar places, far from her cabin, far from the path, sometimes with pine needles in her hair or mud smeared across her nightdress. She described stepping outside in the early hours only to find her footprints already trailing away from the house, as if she had walked a path she couldn't remember taking. She mentioned hearing faint whispers calling her name just before she fell asleep, and stranger still, hearing them more loudly upon waking. What unsettled the search party most wasn't the content itself, but Martha's tone. She hadn't written like someone experiencing a harmless sleepwalking spell. There was fear threaded through every line, a sense of losing control over her own body and mind. She described nights where she felt herself being pulled, her limbs heavy yet obedient to something that wasn't her own will. She wrote of waking beside the creek with the sunrise in her eyes, her feet soaked and numb, with no recollection of how she crossed the steep, rocky ridge that separated the stream from her cabin. She confessed her growing terror that the woods held a presence that didn't just watch her, but beckoned her, whispering in a voice she couldn't understand yet somehow felt compelled to follow. On the final legible portion of the page, she wrote that she no longer trusted herself to stay inside once the whispers began. She feared sleep, feared the darkness, and feared the moment her mind drifted enough for the presence in the woods to reach her again. Then the writing stopped abruptly, the page ending mid-thought, the torn edge jagged as though ripped away in haste, leaving the final fear she intended to confess swallowed by whatever force had drawn her deeper into the forest's grip. The place the searchers later called the hollow where sound disappears was not marked on any map, nor did anyone in Cedar Hollow claim to have ventured there before, but the moment they stepped into it, every man felt an instinctive tightening in his chest, as though he had crossed an unseen threshold. The woods had been quiet throughout the search, but this quiet was different. It was a silence so complete it felt unnatural, heavy, and suffocating. Even the crunch of leaves beneath their boots seemed muted, swallowed before the sound had a chance to rise. The men noticed it almost at once, exchanging uneasy glances as they took in the strange atmosphere of the place. The air was dense and still, carrying no birdsong, no wind rustling the branches, not even the distant babble of the creek they had passed minutes earlier. It was as if the forest had drawn a curtain around this hollow, sealing it off from the rest of the world. Sheriff Dalton held up a hand, signaling the group to stop. They stood in a loose circle, listening, if one could call it listening, when there was nothing left to hear. Caleb Price clapped his hands together once, testing the silence, and even that sharp noise fell flat, echoing nowhere. It was as if the sound had been sucked straight out of the air, absorbed by the trees or the soil or something unseen that hovered just beyond their perception. A few men attempted to call Martha's name, raising their voices louder than necessary, only to find their shouts dulled to a hollow murmur, stripped of their strength. The effect was unsettling, like shouting into a thick blanket or speaking underwater. The hollow itself was unremarkable in appearance, just a depression in the forest floor surrounded by tall sycamores and dense undergrowth, but the longer the men remained there, the more oppressive it felt. The air carried a faint metallic taste, and the temperature seemed to drop by several degrees, turning their breath cold though the midday sun still glowed faintly through the trees. Nora Hale, who had joined the search earlier that day, pressed a hand to her chest, claiming she could feel her heartbeat slowing, thudding heavily as though struggling against the silence itself. As they began to move forward again, the oppressive quiet seemed to tug at them, resisting their steps as if trying to keep them within its boundaries. Each man felt a faint pressure, like invisible hands brushing against their backs, urging them deeper into the hollow's center. It was here, in this pocket of deadened sound, where they began to feel certain, instinctively and overwhelmingly, that Martha had passed through this very place, guided by the same force that now watched them from the edges of the impossible silence. The hanging effigy was discovered as the search party pushed beyond the silent hollow, emerging into a stretch of forest where the trees twisted upward like gnarled fingers reaching for the sky. The daylight had begun to thin, turning the woods a dull copper, and the men were tired, shaken by the unsettling quiet they had just escaped. They spread out again, calling Martha's name despite knowing by now that their voices carried strangely here. It was Nora Hale who stopped first, her breath catching sharply as she pointed upward toward a large sycamore whose bark peeled like pale, curling paper. At first the others didn't understand what she was pointing at, the dimming light making the shape difficult to decipher. But as they stepped closer, the figure came into focus. Suspended from a thick branch by twisted vines was a crude effigy, roughly the height of a small child, fashioned from interwoven sticks, twigs, and strips of bark. Its shape resembled a human form just enough to be disturbing, its limbs spindly and crooked, its torso wrapped tightly with strands of dried grass. The head was nothing more than a knotted clump of branches, but it had been arranged in such a way that it seemed to be staring directly down at them, hollow and accusing. A soft sway moved it, though not a single breath of wind stirred the surrounding trees. It hung perfectly centered above a dark patch of ground, as if placed with careful intention. Sheriff Dalton approached cautiously, his boots crunching the dead underbrush. As he moved closer, his expression hardened. Tangled around the effigy's midsection, knotted tightly enough to bite into the woven sticks, was a strip of faded blue fabric. Nora recognized it immediately as the apron string from Martha Brennan's kitchen apron. She had seen Martha wearing it countless times when carrying water or kneading bread outside her cabin. The fabric was unmistakable, worn, frayed, dyed the particular shade of blue Martha favored. The presence of it here, tied around the belly of a crude forest idol dangling high in the trees, made every person present understand that this effigy had not been here long. It had been made recently, crafted by someone, or something, with access to Martha and her belongings. Caleb Price studied the vines holding the effigy aloft. They were braided tightly, unnaturally so, as if woven with far more strength than human hands could manage. He tugged at one, expecting it to snap like any dry vine, but it held firm, unyielding and cold. A few of the men muttered that children might have made it as a prank, but the forest around them felt too watchful, too intentional, for such an explanation to sit comfortably. The longer they stood beneath the hanging figure, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, as though the effigy was less an object and more a warning. A sign left behind to mark a boundary they were not meant to cross. A silent declaration that they were now following Martha into a part of the forest claimed by something that understood them well enough to leave a message crafted in her own torn belongings. The nighttime return of the voices began subtly at first, like an echo of sound carried on the wind, but soon the entire village grew aware of it. After the effigy was found, the searchers returned to Cedar Hollow shaken and uneasy, planning to regroup at first light. But as dusk settled over the town, a strange stillness crept into the air, the kind that signals a coming storm even when the sky is clear. People shut their windows early, sensing something was wrong, though they couldn't yet name it. And then, as the last streak of sunlight faded behind the ridge, the whispers began. They started near the tree line, barely audible, drifting in slow, uncertain waves. Children heard them first, thinking it was the sound of someone calling in the distance, but when parents leaned closer and listened, every face went pale. The voices weren't shaped like normal speech. They rose and broke in strange cadences, sometimes rhythmic, sometimes stuttering, always quiet enough that the listener had to hold their breath to catch the patterns. What unsettled the villagers most was how the voices seemed to shift, moving from one side of the woods to another, circling the outskirts of the settlement as though pacing. Many claimed the whispers sounded like Martha's voice, softer and more strained than usual, repeating her own name as if trying to remember it. Others swore the whispers overlapped with a second tone, far deeper than any human throat could produce. This lower voice seemed to answer Martha, almost coaxing, almost amused, and every time it drifted through the dark, dogs cowered under porches and refused to move. Livestock huddled near their barns, restless and trembling, watching the trees as though expecting something to emerge at any moment. Eli Turner, the widower who had heard the voices the night before Martha vanished, sat on his porch with his lantern dimmed, too frightened to speak. He recognized the sound immediately, that same unsettling pairing of Martha's fearful responses and the other voice's slow, predatory calm. But this time it was louder, clearer, as if whatever had whispered at her cabin had moved closer, stepping out of the darkness it once hid within. Eli watched the edge of the woods, seeing nothing but feeling eyes on him, tracking him with a stillness that made his bones ache. He whispered a prayer, though he wasn't sure who he was praying to anymore. By midnight, more villagers had gathered along the main road, drawn out not by curiosity but by a collective sense of dread, as if facing the voices was safer than hiding from them. They stood shoulder to shoulder, staring into the pitch-black timber. The whispers rose again, this time louder, almost insistent, like something calling out for a witness, or perhaps an invitation. The old folk muttered that the woods don't call a person twice unless it intends to take more than one. And with each passing minute, more and more townspeople felt a chilling certainty that the thing calling Martha's name had not come to mourn her. It had come looking for someone else to answer. The trail of bones was found on the 5th morning of the search, when the forest was soaked with dew and the sun struggled to break through a heavy veil of gray clouds. By then, the villagers were exhausted, hollow-eyed, and haunted by the whispers that had circled Cedar Hollow through the night. Still, they pushed deeper into the woods, following the direction from which the voices had seemed strongest. Sheriff Dalton led the way, moving with a grim determination, while the others tried to ignore the sinking feeling that they were no longer searching for Martha, but for whatever had taken her. The terrain grew harsher as they advanced, the ground sloping into tight ravines filled with roots like grasping hands. It was Caleb Price who spotted the first bone, lying at the base of a rotting tree trunk, half buried under curled leaves. At first he assumed it belonged to a deer, but the shape was wrong, too straight, too smooth, too clean. A human radius, bleached unnaturally pale despite the dampness of the forest floor. As the men gathered around, Nora Hale moved ahead and found a second bone a few yards deeper, a femur this time, its ends strangely polished, as if handled or rubbed repeatedly. Then more appeared, scattered in a loose line that cut through the brush like a grim breadcrumb trail. Some were cracked, others broken cleanly in half, but all had the same pale, unnatural sheen, as though whatever had carried them had drained them of warmth before discarding them. Dalton examined one closely and noticed thin scoring marks running along the surface. Not from teeth. Not from a knife. The grooves were too long and too deliberate, as if something had scraped its fingers, or claws, over the bone, testing its texture. A sense of nausea washed over the group as they realized the bones belonged to more than one person. Some were small, fragile. Others were unmistakably adult. It became clear that this path had not been created recently. It represented years, perhaps decades, of vanishings that Cedar Hollow had blamed on wandering animals, sudden storms, or misfortune. The trail led them toward a narrow ravine choked with vines. The deeper they went, the more the bones appeared, arranged with an almost ritualistic precision, tucked into branches, perched on rocks, aligned along the ground. It wasn't random. It was intentional. A display. A warning. Or an invitation. The forest grew unnervingly quiet as they advanced, as though acknowledging that they had finally reached the place where the thing that whispered in the dark wanted them to be. Standing at the mouth of the ravine, with the trail of bones vanishing into the gloom, every member of the search party understood the same terrible truth: whatever had taken Martha Brennan had been here long before her, and now that they had crossed into its territory, it wasn't finished with them either.